Hola a todos.
Hello everyone.
La casta y los
The elite and the
socialistas tienen
socialists
miedo.
are afraid.
Buenas tardes
Good
a
afternoon,
todos.
everyone.
Quiero
I want to thank the
agradecer a las
CPAC
autoridades
authorities
de
for
CPAC
the
por la
invitation
invitación
and President Jair Bolsonaro
y al
and
presidente
Eduardo
Jair
Bolsonaro
Bolsonaro
for the warm welcome
y
I
a Eduardo
received.
Bolsonaro por la cálida bienvenida que he
They truly
recibido.
make me feel at home,
Realmente me hacen
and
sentir
it's
como en
always a
casa
pleasure to be
y
among
es siempre un
friends.
placer estar entre amigos. Hoy quiero hablarles de la
Today
receta
I want to
económica
talk
y
to you
cultural
about
del
the
socialismo en
economic and
América
cultural
Latina.
recipe for socialism
Sobre
in
que
Latin
ellos están
America,
equivocados
about how they are
y
wrong and we
nosotros
are
tenemos
right,
razón.
and how
Y
the
si
battle
cómo
for
se está
Argentina's
librando la
destiny has
batalla
been
por el destino de la
unfolding since we
Argentina
took
desde que
office.
asumimos la presidencia. Si analizamos los distintos casos de gobiernos socialistas
If we
o de
analyze
izquierda
the
en
various
América Latina en
cases
los
of
últimos 20
socialist or
años,
leftist governments in Latin
encontrarán
America
seguramente
over
una
the
serie
last
de
20
denominadores
years,
comunes que
we will
aparecen en
surely find a
conjunto
series of common
y que
denominators
constituyen
that
una
appear
verdadera
together
receta
and
del
constitute a
desastre,
true
tanto en
recipe
lo
for
económico, en lo
disaster,
social, en lo
economically,
político y en lo
socially,
cultural,
politically, and
porque hay una
culturally.
relación de causalidad entre
Because
todos
there is a
estos
causal
elementos y
relationship
no es una
between
mera
all these elements,
coincidencia.
and it is not a mere coincidence.
Por favor, tomen asiento para que los que están atrás... ¿Estamos bien ya? En primer lugar,
First, it is notable that the socialists begin with a period of economic prosperity in a context of orderly public accounts and high international commodity prices. In this initial period, the economy grows. Society gains purchasing power, the state collects revenue, and the central bank accumulates reserves. But socialist governments become enamored with the popularity generated by the prosperity they inherited, become afraid that it will not last forever, and indiscriminately increase public spending to sustain it. How do they do this? By subsidizing rates and public services, increasing public employment, and distributing handouts of various kinds, which they label as social inclusion. When money runs out, they start raising taxes to collect more, but the cost is a contraction of economic activity and the destruction of investment. As time goes on, they consume stocks to fund a fictitious boom that only mortgages the future. The stocks continue to dwindle until, at some point, they must resort to debt. They never solve the underlying problem, which is the vicious cycle of expanding public spending and the resulting fiscal deficit. They simply look for different ways to continue financing it. When they can no longer resort to taxes or debt, they resort to the worst of all evils, issuing money, thereby destroying the value of their currencies and condemning the entire population to poverty. Along the way, they impose regulation upon regulation on every problem that arises, so as not to solve the underlying problem. In each of these patches, they invent a business for a friend, generating a caste of crony entrepreneurs protected by political power who compete artificially, fishing in a fishbowl. The cost of all this, sooner or later, is paid by the people. The same people socialist governments claim to protect, but actually want to enslave in order to secure a captive support base that allows them to remain in power. Because we cannot fool ourselves. The only thing socialists are interested in is power for power's sake. The consequence is that people end up paying for rampant inflation, what they are given in subsidies. And they end up paying for the industrial and manufacturing protection policies that governments promote to benefit their friends with more expensive and lower quality goods. We've seen this story dozens of times throughout the region and the rest of the world as well. It is nothing more and nothing less than the story of 21st century socialism, which our Latin American brothers and sisters have heard so much about and which is defended by all the populists who make up the Puebla Group, formerly known as the São Paulo Forum. I don't need to tell you in detail how this recipe for disaster has worked in Argentina over the last 100 years, and particularly over the last 20. It's enough to remember that we've had fiscal deficits in 113 of the last 123 years, that our politicians irresponsibly multiplied our monetary base 25,000 trillion times over the last 70 years, and this isn't a report, it's hard data. It's enough to remember that since 1975, the percentage of Argentines below the poverty line has multiplied by 10, that we have the same GDP per capita as in 2007, and that the formal economy hasn't generated genuine employment for over 10 years. It's enough to see, with great anger, that while we were sinking, the rest of the countries that had more liberal economies were progressing. But even so, within the scope of case studies of Latin American socialism, the Argentine catastrophe can be considered an intermediate case. The question is why? Because, no matter how hard they tried, they never managed to take the socialist program to its ultimate consequences. Because they could never fully subjugate society, finding a limit in a rebellious people who safeguard their own freedom, who tooth and nail protect their property from the confiscatory clutches of politicians, and who resist being dominated. This explains why Argentina is so popular among those who converted from socialism in the region. Despite the fact that they have prospered in Argentina over the last 15 years without privileges, it has been impossible, because one can easily understand why there are 500,000 Venezuelans in Chile, which is historically a country with a free economy. Even though in recent years the model that generated so much well-being for ordinary Chileans has been questioned in Argentina. As difficult as it is, that's why it's always a pleasure to talk with our dear Venezuelan residents and realize that there are no more anti-communist and anti-Kirchnerists than they are. In the long run, socialism is unsustainable and necessarily fails. And governments that persist on this path either end up being rejected by society or end up violating freedom and playing with the lives of their citizens to preserve their power. Time and again, history shows that the same people who pay lip service to democracy, pluralism, and oppression are the ones willing to bend the rules and even disrupt the constitutional order to entrench themselves in the palace when the people demand change. Look at what happened in Venezuela. There isn't a single sensible government in the world that doesn't recognize that it is a bloodthirsty dictatorship. Look at what happened in Bolivia in 2019, when Evo Morales persisted with an unconstitutional third term. Look at the judicial persecution our friend Jair Bolsonaro is suffering in Brazil. And look at what's happening in Bolivia right now. They are willing to stage a fake coup d'état just to score a few more points in an election. Therefore, when I say that Argentina is an intermediate case, it is only in relative terms, because it is a point of comparison with the humanitarian horror of other murderous dictatorships in the region, such as Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, from which 7 million people fled in the last decade to avoid sharing the hunger with those who stayed behind. And that's not to mention the socialist experiences of the 20th century in Europe and Asia, which claimed the lives of more than 100 million human beings. That's why I say that, since socialism is an ideology that goes directly against human nature, it necessarily leads to slavery or death. There is no other possible destiny for socialism. But obviously, the descent into socialism does not happen overnight, nor does it spring from a cabbage. None of this is possible without a constant cultural effort to grind down those of us who defend the free market, capitalism, and the values that made Western civilization the spearhead of the history of human progress. It's an effort that, unfortunately, many people of power and influence in the free world have taken for granted. Just look at the ideas defended by many supranational organizations, NGOs, educational institutions, the entertainment industry, and the media. One wonders why they do it. In some cases, they do so out of well-intentioned intent, eager to be good or supportive. In many cases, it's also because they are hypocritical partners and live off the funding that socialism allows them. In most cases, they don't realize they're playing with fire and are buying into a closed package destined for the tragic consequences we already know. They don't realize how destructive implementing the ideas of socialism can be, because it feels too far away. But we must understand that the combination of do-goodism and dirigism leads to the worst of all situations. Do-gooders think that good intentions and empathy lead to good results. And they have the audacity to think that by directing the behavior of each member of society, more efficient joint behavior can be coordinated. They even boast that they can do it optimally. They see a problem and assume the solution is to throw the state at it, and they call that justice. But Hayek taught us that this is the fatal arrogance of human beings. And every time the state intervenes, it will have a worse outcome than if it hadn't interfered at all. Take, for example, freedom of expression, a fundamental value of democracy, which is nevertheless questioned in the world's major powers, under the excuse of not offending anyone's sensibilities or respecting the supposed rights of certain vocal minorities who want to impose their minority views on the rest of the population. World history has shown that this type of behavior ends in censorship and oppression. And yet, it's increasingly common to hear how in countries where one believed the basic principles of democracy were respected, aberrations are committed in terms of freedom of expression and censorship. These are things that seem distant or abstract, but everyone looks at what is unfortunately beginning to happen today in Brazil and thinks twice. Furthermore, as Thomas Sowell says, the censorship and regulation of speech promoted by socialism is nothing more than a confession of its intellectual bankruptcy and a tacit declaration of defeat in the cultural battle. Because they don't dare confront us in the marketplace of ideas, because they know they can't defeat us, they intervene and prohibit the circulation of ideas they don't like, and subsidize the ideas they do. It's time for us to recover the concept of justice that they believe they own, but which they have actually tainted. Because justice, for them, is fatally arrogant, and in the name of social justice, they have committed the most unjust atrocities. In the name of justice, they have expropriated wealth that took generations to build. In the name of justice, they have invented captive markets for friendly businessmen. In the name of justice, they have repeatedly violated fundamental human rights. In the name of justice, they have taken from some to give to others, who happen to be their children or their friends. If you have any doubts, go see how the families of these champions of 21st century socialism live. Look at how Maduro's family lives. Look at how the children of some in their own country live. They are all multimillionaires who live as if they founded Google. Because of this, they have lost the right to speak of justice, not only because of the atrocities they committed or endorsed, but also because they have a fundamentally flawed understanding of what justice is. Because you know what? The more regulations and restrictions a society has, the less just it is. The more it confiscates the fruits of its labor through taxes from those who produce, the less just it is. The more bureaucrats a state has tasked with scrutinizing what its citizens do and looking for ways to ruin their lives, the less just that society is. Furthermore, the more laws a country has, the less just it is, especially if they are laws that question the pillars of our society and our constitutional rights, which are the defense of life, liberty, and property, or our version here, God, country, and family. Because justice is not that we are all equal. Justice is that those who make an effort and, if they apply it, can appropriate the fruits of their efforts and not have to see those who do nothing but have a friend in power progress in life. How many cases have we, our Latin American brothers and sisters, known of people who have become millionaires overnight simply because they are friends of those in power? That's the story of 21st century socialism. Justice means that every person can translate that effort into savings and can use those savings to build a better life for themselves and their families. Justice means a better life and realizing that plan and making it possible. Ultimately, justice means that everyone is the master of their own life, or, as we say, that everyone can once again become the architect of their own destiny. That is justice. Therefore, it's false that the left is the ideology of the poor and the oppressed. It's becoming increasingly clear in Latin America that the left is the ideology of the rich, the powerful who control and hold prominent positions in cultural dissemination. All of them obviously in cahoots with power. And it's becoming increasingly clear that poverty is a tool for those who preach socialism. Because the operational praxis of socialism consists of having the poor as clients of its system. Because the day the poor become independent, progress in life, and escape poverty, socialism loses a client. But obviously, they want me to tell you something about Argentina. It's impossible to ignore the winds of change blowing in Argentina today. You know Argentine history very well. Did you ever imagine you would see someone like me sitting in the Rivadavia chair? Did you imagine you would hear an Argentine president defend the ideas I defend, with the conviction of radical change that I have? Or did you ever imagine a libertarian liberal as president of a country? Argentina is going through an exceptional moment in its history, where society, for the first time in decades, rejects the statist model, the model applied in many of our sister countries over the last 20 years, which has run its course after accumulating mountains of misery. Society rejects this model and demands profound change. It is saying enough is enough to 21st century socialism. But even after all the damage the socialists have done, after leaving a country with a 15-point consolidated deficit, drowning in debt and without creditworthiness, and having to rescue it from imminent hyperinflation, after all that, they continue to do everything possible to boycott the only way out of the disaster they themselves created. At this point in the game, 7 months after assuming command of the nation, we are the government that has received the most obstacles in history, and it is clear that they will not hesitate to oppose everything we try, no matter how much good Argentines need and demand those changes. That is why they have done everything possible to boycott the deregulation of the labor market that we are promoting. Despite the fact that Argentina needs more and better quality jobs, not less. Even though it's clear that the only way to create more and better jobs is with more and better companies. And for there to be more and better companies, hiring must be a viable option, not an act of charity, yet they oppose it. They are willing to harm millions of Argentine workers just to see the government fail. That's why they've also done everything possible to boycott investment promotion. Investments that weren't coming due to the legal uncertainty they themselves created. It's important to remember the obvious. Without private investment, there is no genuine economic activity. And there is no private investment if it's not profitable for a company to invest. Period. So either they don't understand a basic premise of economics, which makes them incapable of governing the country, as they've already demonstrated, or they are actively trying to boycott the government and ensure its failure. But all this shouldn't come as a surprise to us, because deep down, they not only prefer us to fail, not only is it electorally convenient for us to fail, but they need it on a vital level. Because if we succeed, we will have dismantled the corrupt system through which they suck the lifeblood of the 47 million Argentines in every place where socialism prevails. That's why they can't allow Argentina to do well, because they know that if Argentina does well, they do poorly. That's why the level of obstruction they present will be proportional to the depth of the change we want to bring about. And we're already seeing what they're prepared to do to prevent us from moving forward. We've seen it throughout the region, we've seen it in Chile, we've seen it in Brazil, and we're seeing it in Argentina. They're willing to resort to violence and extortion to obstruct the changes that society demands. That's why they launched the fastest general strike in history, just weeks after taking office, in response to our stabilization plan and our economic deregulation project. And that's why, a few days ago, they sent a small army to wreak havoc at the gates of Congress, setting cars on fire and vandalizing the city, seeking to extort legislators into rejecting our reforms. But you know what? We've done it. We've passed the most important labor and economic reform in Argentine history. We've passed a reform 5 times larger than Menem's, which had been the largest reform in Argentina. And if you add to that the decree of necessity and urgency from when we took office, today the reforms are 8 times larger than the largest reform in Argentine history. In other words, we're not only fighting inflation, but we're fundamentally transforming the Argentine economy.
Y quiero decirles algo.
And I want to tell you something. We're going to get out of poverty. Whether the socialists like it or not, with or without your support. Because the vast majority of Argentines chose the profound regime change we promised during our campaign. And they chose it with the most comfortable electoral result in decades. We have an unwavering commitment to fulfill the will of the majority, even if the beneficiaries of this corrupt, parasitic, and impoverishing system move heaven and earth to boycott us. They will not pass, they will not succeed. We will move the country forward. In this regard, I want to thank everyone here today who have come to listen to me and to listen to all of us who defend the ideas of freedom. I want to tell you that the winds of change are blowing in the world, that the ideas of impoverishing socialism have failed, and the people know it. The people know that socialism is always and everywhere an impoverishing and violently murderous phenomenon. That is why they are dying out, and we are going to kick them out everywhere they are. Because they have failed economically, they have failed politically, they have failed culturally, and they have failed socially. And as if this were not enough, they have murdered more than 150 million human beings. It is time for the world to wake up and say never again to socialism. Because socialism is the ideology of resentment, envy, and hatred. But beyond all that, socialism is the idea of failure. No one knows more about this than we, our Latin American brothers and sisters. But this wind of change that began in Argentina and today sweeps the world will reach every corner where freedom is repressed. Because the history of humanity is the history of freedom. And nothing and no one can stop it. Finally, for those less optimistic people who believe the battle is lost, that we cannot confront the power structures that have taken over our countries, I want to tell you that the person speaking to you has reached where he or she is without any structure, without money, without a political party, and without support from the traditional media, but with fists full of truth and the unshakable conviction that life without freedom is not worth living. Believe me, it can be done. So today I want to tell you, trust in yourselves. Take control of your destiny, fight in every corner where necessary, and have faith that if you do so with conviction, you will achieve your goal. Because as the book of Maccabees says, victory in battle depends not on the number of soldiers, but on the power that comes from heaven. And this is just the beginning. Long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it. Thank you very much. Thank you all.